Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Fear the Forest, Volume 2, Story Number 1. This story was told to me by my mother and was also told to me by my best friend's mother. There are a lot of witnesses to this story, and most of them grew up on Paddle Creek. Some people believe Paddle Creek to be haunted. At night, you could hear screaming in the woods. My mother told me it sounded like a woman screaming. It would raise the hair on the back of your neck, so they called it the screaming thing. Some people believed it to be an old crazy lady that lived down the road from my best friend's house. Some believed it to be a big cat at one time, but there is no such cat in these parts. The funny thing is that you could hear it on one side of the woods, then a few seconds later on the other side. There is no old lady or big cat that fast, and some believed it to be the ghost of some kind. Some people would see black figures at the time of the screaming. My mother was coming home from church one night when all at once a black figure sailed out from a tree over her head and went over a hillside. Then the screaming started, and mother hurried home. People have tried to chase it down, but every time they would find nothing. Hunters would wait for it just to come home empty handed. No one could catch it, and no one knew what it was, even up to today. Story number 2. A friend of my brother's bought a house in the Albright area about a year ago. My friend also moved into his brother's house as a caretaker. I visited him there in June of 2010 for a week. The first night I stayed in the house, I felt a little on edge, as it felt like I was being watched by something. The second night I woke out of a sound sleep at about 3:15 a.m. and felt as if I had a weight on my chest. It was almost like feeling something heavy in the air in the house. As I laid in bed trying to fall back asleep, I could hear something that sounded like a man moaning outside my window. It would start out as a light moan, but then it would turn into a heavy breathing sound. This happened all week until I left. I thought nothing of it. Maybe just my wild imagination. Then in late September of 2010, I returned back for a second visit. But this time my brother came with me. Almost immediately, I felt the same feeling of being watched, and every morning at 3:15 a.m., I would wake up. Shortly after being awakened out of a sound sleep, I would hear that same moaning again. This time, though, my brother heard the same thing as I did every night. I told my friend, who lives in the house, about what we were experiencing. He said, "It's probably a buck grunting near the window outside the house." I told him I knew what a buck grunt sounded like, and this was no deer grunt. My brother was so scared that he grabbed a 30-30 that hangs on the wall and locked all the doors. As the moaning turned into a heaving type of breathing sound coming from outside, the living room window began to shake. The sound of footsteps could be heard walking around the sides of the house from outside. This scared the crap out of us, and what happened was that neither one of us ever went back to that house. Story number 3. It was the night of July 6th. My 3 friends and I were camping out in the tent in our backyard. We were doing fairly well alone by ourselves until we went out to give the dog a drink of water. When the 4 of us came back in, the zipper to the tent door got stuck. I was scared of the outside, so I tried as quick as I could to zip the door shut. I failed, so my oldest friend tried again. While she was doing it, I went to the back of the tent, and all of a sudden, someone or something hit the front of the tent. We all started to scream. My friend and I started to laugh, thinking it was my mom. But when I started to call to her, I realized it was not her. I stuck my head out of the tent door to see if anyone was there, still thinking it may still be my mom, but I saw no one. We all started to scream and backed up, knowing nobody was there. Another hit to the tent, and then a shadow appeared. I was not all the way to the back of the tent yet, so I hit the shadow to find just plain air. My dog ran out the door, scared from the screaming. In spite of the dog, we ran too. I ran along one side of the tent to see if anyone was there, while the others ran around to the other side. And guess what? I didn't see anything. When we reached the door, My mother was standing there because of the screaming. Later that night, my friends, mother, and I went to collect the tent items to find no sign of anyone. Within 5 minutes coming back, a storm started. We knew this was not a person because we have no neighbors for at least half a mile. If this was a sign of the storm, we're not sure, but it scared us. For a long time, we never went out and pitched a tent in the backyard. Next story. This happened a few years ago. It happened in 1950 when I was about 10 years old. We lived in an old log house set halfway up a hill in the middle of a pasture field. There were no houses within a half mile of us. A barbed wire fence completely surrounded the house to keep cattle out of the yard. At that time, we didn't even have electricity. My dad worked as a helper in a truck, and at times he was gone for a day or two. One night, Mom and I were alone when the dog began barking. He went out into the pasture, and then suddenly I could hear yelping, and he came back running and hid under the house. Suddenly there was a tremendous bang, and the house shook, and the windows rattled. Both Mom and I were scared to death. The dog went into the field barking once again, and then came back and raced under the house. Again came the loud bang, and the house shook. This happened a few times over the next month or so. One night, Dad was home, and he opened the rear door and yelled out, "Get out!" It only happened one time after that. We never knew what it was. There was another strange event that happened many years later. I grew up out there in the country and finally relocated and became a police officer. My wife and I bought an old farm with an old house on it that was not worth staying in. One night, we were down there for the weekend and camped out far up in the hollow from the house. Where it was located was sort of remote. We pitched a tent and built a fire after it became dark. Suddenly, I heard the strangest noises I had ever heard, coming from the woods above where we were camping. The sounds were a strange mixture of growls and something else I can't describe. I grew up around animals, and I've heard a lot of dogs fight. This was not a dog fight, and it was extremely loud. I grew concerned and fired my gun into the ground, and it suddenly stopped. I slept a little uneasy that night, but I never heard it again. The next story. This happened to my friend, Jonathan, me, and his brother. We all decided to go up to Witchy Hollow to see if we could see the ghost. We went to the end of the road and turned around, and on the way back, we found a place to park. After we parked, we turned off all the lights. We sat there a few minutes, and Jonathan told us that there were headlights coming from behind us. We never heard the car or heard it throw any gravel since we were on a gravel road. The car stopped a little in front of us. The interior lights were on, and there was only a shadow for a driver. The car pulled out, and you still didn't hear the car run. It went over a hill and lit up all the trees, and then it got dark, and then we saw the headlights coming toward us again. By this time, we had gotten ready to leave, and the car stopped beside us once more. When we were leaving, we looked to see if there was a place to turn a car around, and the nearest place was a half mile away, plus the road was very narrow. If what we saw that night wasn't a ghost, there's a few unanswered questions like, why didn't we hear the car run? Why didn't we hear it throw gravel when the car was moving? And why was there nothing inside the car but a shadow? Next story. Back in the 50s, my parents moved from Harts to 14 Mountain on Route 10. We moved in a house that was set right beside the old Curve Inn Tavern. We hadn't lived there very long until we started hearing noises on the stairs. It sounded like someone walking up and down the stairs. Mother was getting really aggravated and scared. She told my dad that every morning about the same time she would hear this. One morning, Dad's ride to the mines didn't show up. He had to stay home that day. Mom was washing clothes in the kitchen, and my brother and I were watching the television. She had Dad in the kitchen telling him that she was glad he was there, that she wanted him to hear the sounds that she heard every morning at the same time. He said okay. He got him a cup of coffee and a cigarette and went into the living room to wait on the noise. Sure enough, it started. The footsteps started at the top and went to the bottom step. It turned and went back up. She said, "Now do you believe me? I'm not crazy. The boys hear it every morning like clockwork." We agreed. Mom went back to the kitchen to finish her wash. Dad sat there looking over the steps. smoked another cigarette, and sent me to the back room to get him a claw hammer. He started to take down the wall by the stairs. Sure enough, he shone his flashlight back inside the hole and told me to go get my mother. He took her up to the stairs and showed her what he had discovered. She went wild. She said she would spend another night in that house and for him to find another place to live that very day. They took what they found and burned it in the fire barrel. We never spent another night in the house. Mom stayed with our grandmother until Dad found us a place to live back at Hart's. What they found was a mummified sheet, covered with dried blood. It was tied at the head and the feet with rope. The body had been moved some time after it had been put in the sheet. Dad never said a word about it. There's a culvert on the left side of the curve. It goes underneath the road. Years later, a man's body was found in that culvert. Some of the older residents probably remember it being found. We moved out of that house and it burned down back in the 80s. No one has ever lived there or mentioned hearing anything strange like we used to. Next story. I've been best friends with this guy since we were in the 5th grade. His parents own a house in a subdivision just outside of Winfield, but live in Point Pleasant. Anyway, we get together with a group of friends every so often at the house just to get away from parents, spouses, whoever, and just have fun. Kind of like a guy's night out, but we stay in and watch movies, link some Xboxes together and kill each other in video games or whatever. We've been doing this for almost 20 years off and on. On Thursday, October 23rd of 2003, a friend of ours was in from New Orleans and we were at the house playing Halo. There were 4 of us in the house. 2 were down the hall in the den, and I and another guy were in the living room. All the lights in the house were off except the light in the den and the light in the kitchen, which partially illuminated the living room. We had been playing for a couple of hours when I started seeing movement out of the corner of my eye. It kind of looked like someone in gray clothing was walking by the doorway to the living room, heading for the kitchen. I thought one of the guys down the hall was going to get some pizza, but no one ever arrived in the kitchen. It kept happening, and every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. I kept taking my glasses off and rubbing my eyes and cleaning my glasses, even though what I was seeing wasn't through the lenses, since it was always out of the corner of my eye. It started getting me mad because it kept distracting me from the game, but I didn't say anything. A little while later, we took a break and the guy whose parents owned the house came down the hall with a confused look on his face and said, "I don't know what's wrong with me, but I keep seeing things move out of the corner of my eye." He then proceeded to tell us that it was always in that hallway, and it looked like someone, a big someone, in a gray sweatshirt walking around, and that he had been seeing it all day, even before anyone else was there. At first he thought it was our friend from New Orleans, who's over 6.5 feet tall and weighs over 300 pounds, but he didn't show up until after my friend started seeing this thing in the house. Since I didn't want to taint his description, I asked him to describe it before I said anything about seeing the same thing. He described the exact same thing I had been seeing, in the same place, and even in some of the same times. The best way to describe what I saw is like this. You know when you squint real hard, so your eyes barely open, how everything has that blurred, hazy look to it? Imagine seeing someone like that, dressed all in gray and walking past a darkened doorway, but your eyes are wide open. It was really freaky, especially with my friend seeing the same thing. I had always wondered how I would react if I was ever faced with something possibly paranormal. Would I freeze, run in fear, or what? I guess what I would do is sit there and joke about it being a ghost for a few minutes and go back to playing Halo because that's what we did. But like I said, we've been meeting at the house for about 20 years, and this is the first time anyone has seen anything out of the ordinary there. And we hadn't seen anything of it again since we talked about it that night. Also, the other 2 guys in the house, one of which was sitting between me and the door when I kept seeing it, didn't see anything at all. But, like all stories, there was an update. I worked at an old house museum which is also supposed to be haunted. And I was talking to the son of one of our volunteers a couple of weekends, and the conversation came around to ghosts. His father used to have my position at the museum before moving on to bigger and better things, so he knew about the ghost stories from the museum. I made the comment that I had been working at the museum for over a year, but I hadn't seen or heard anything supernatural or really unexplainable. So I told him about the story I had experienced, the Halo story. Well, unbeknown to me, he was a member of MAGADA and had a little experience with investigations. So when I was describing to him what I saw, using the squinty-eyed analogy, he interrupted me and said, "Did it kind of look like a big mass of smoke? Like someone had a cigarette and was moving it around?" I was stunned. He just described perfectly what I had seen. He said, "Yeah, that's ectoplasm." I had to go give a tour to a group of visitors, and we didn't get to discuss it any further than that. But it did lend some credence to the experience. But as to who or what it was, that's remained a mystery. Next story. I never believe other people's ghost stories until I experienced my own in 1986. I'm a man in his 30s who usually thinks rationally, but I still get the chills when I think of what happened to me and my two friends, Alan and James, on a cold winter night. My friend James invited Alan and me over one night to spend the night with him and his mom. They lived in a large white duplex on the corner of Lee Avenue and Chestnut Street, across the street from Oddfellows Cemetery. Ironically, my great-grandfather is buried in that cemetery. For those who are familiar with the term, a duplex is a house split down the middle and rented out to separate renters. James and his mother lived in the right half of the duplex, and his room was in the attic. Anyway, since James' mom was working the midnight shift, it was just the three of us in the house alone. We were up in James' room playing Nintendo late that night when all of a sudden we heard children running and laughing on what sounded like the first flight of stairs leading to the second floor of the house. Plain as day, we all heard it, and immediately thought the renter next door had company. The more we listened, the more it dawned on us that it was 3 in the morning, and no small kid would be up at that time of night, especially kids that young. So, what did we do? We walked down the 2 flights of stairs and out into the front yard to see if the old man was home. James thought his neighbor had gone to visit family that week. To our surprise, there was not one single light on in that side of the house. So we reluctantly walked back into the house and up to his room and commenced playing Nintendo again. Not 2 minutes later it started up again, but closer this time, like it was right outside the attic door on the second floor of the house. What we saw still brings tears to my eyes today. The staircase from the second floor to James' room was dark, and the light from the hallway would shine under the door at the bottom of the staircase. We saw shadows moving underneath the door of the attic. Really scared of what we were seeing, we decided, after about 5 minutes of debating, to charge the attic door, thinking it was someone trying to scare us. As we started down the old rickety attic stairs, you could hear the sound of what we believed to be children running from us towards the stairs to the first floor. The house had all hardwood floors, so the sound is very distinct. We got to the door, slung it open, and followed the noise to the first floor. When we got to the first floor, it stopped. We then heard an awful scream, like a woman in pain. Well, that's all it took. We were petrified. After that, it's all kind of blurry. I do remember getting dressed and leaving for home that night at 3 in the morning, and never going back. My friend James said he never heard anything else that night, but did say other things happened to him at other times. Needless to say, he and his mom moved a month later. The thing that really solidifies my story is, about a year later, I was introduced to 2 books in high school. One was titled Coffin Hollow, and the other one The Telltale Lilac Bush. I read a story, if memory serves me correctly, called The Haunted House. This story is about a white mansion on the hill across from a cemetery in Clarksburg, where a woman with 2 small kids lived. One night, she takes in a weary traveler. The next morning, the traveler finds the 2 kids murdered by their mother. To this day, when I drive by that house, I get cold chills, and I've never ever noticed anyone living there since. So don't always think, if you're reading a ghost story, that it's nonsense. It just might have some fact to it. Next story. In January of 1994, my parents and I were looking for a new house. We were staying in an apartment above the store that my dad owned in 100 West Virginia. We found a very nice log house that was only 8 years old in Wadestown on Camp Run. Within a week we moved in. The house is located at the end of a long 2-mile road. The road is called Joy Run, and it connects with Camp Run. One day, on my way home from school, I noticed a forgotten graveyard that was in the woods along the road that led to my house. There were about 20 headstones, which I later found, but back to the story. On my parents' property, there used to be an old log cabin that was burnt to the ground. I never heard much of the place, but I do know what I've seen and what I've heard. One day, I was in the basement of the log house and I was talking on the telephone. I noticed, looking into the doorway that led into the washroom, a white smoky figure. It rose up from the ground and formed into the shape of a person and then went back into the ground. I couldn't believe my eyes. Another time, I was downstairs and I glanced at my dad's toolbox and I saw a little girl wearing an old dress, something that you would see in an old western. She was leaning over looking at my dad's tools and then just vanished. A few months later, I was in the washroom and I was facing the dryer. I was only 3 feet away from the dryer. It wasn't even running. I stood up against the wall and I said to myself, I don't feel good. All of a sudden, I heard a voice say, Are you all right? It was a woman's voice and it was loud and clear. I took off running. I hadn't ever been so scared in my life. I ran upstairs and went to bed. Sometimes you can be at my parents' house and hear the sliding glass doors open and shut by itself. But when you run over to see it, the door is closed. One day my mom was all alone in the house and she heard a girl's voice say, Where's my baby doll? My mom kept hearing the voice. It went all around the house, but you didn't see a thing. Later on in the year, my sister was cleaning and looked up on a shelf where she kept one of her baby dolls. I have 3 sisters and each of them has a doll. Amy, the sister that was cleaning at that time, picked up her baby doll. Amy's doll was dressed in black. It kind of looks like it's dressed to go to a funeral. She pulled the veil back and the baby's doll's hair had turned green. She threw the doll down and screamed. She picked it up and touched the hair, and it started to fall out. Amy got the other 2 dolls and checked the hair on them, and they were fine. Amy still has a doll to this day. My parents still live in that log house at the end of the hill. Then one night, my brother Jeremiah came over. We went to the old graveyard and counted the headstones. We did find a family that had a mother, father, a boy, and 2 girls. All 3 children and the mother died the same year. It doesn't have the day. The father died the following year. Still to this day you can hear noises and even drive by and see the old forgotten graveyard. But just who is it that haunts that house? We're just not sure. Next story. I live in a rural area and I sell vintage and collectible items. One evening, back in 2002, I was alone and up quite late doing research on the internet. My computer's in the living room, which is open to the dining room area where I can look up into the room from my chair. I'm not really sure when I became aware of it. It seems I ignored the first few, but I looked up because there was a tapping noise. I was hearing a tapping noise, like the sound of a fingernail on the glass. Just one tap at a time, and then moments would go by before another just like it. My ears told me the sound came from the large ground floor window behind the dining room table, and I wondered if someone was outside the window tapping. I opened the living room door, stepped out on the porch, and could see up the side of the house to the window because of the bright overhead pole light. There was no one there, and I came back in and listened. After a moment, another tap came. So, I turned to the dining room light and walked to the window. The tapping continued, but now it was coming more frequently. Still just one tap at a time between pauses, and not emanating from the window itself. I wondered if there might be a mouse on the wall, so I got on my knees and put my ear to the wall next to the window, and as each tap came, I knew I was close but not finding the exact spot. I then had to pick up one of the dining room chairs to move it out of the way so I could continue to search by ear, and as I moved the chair I heard the tap move with it. I looked down, and there on the chair was a small, open cardboard box containing 6 vintage restaurant parfait glasses. I'd recently acquired them and was planning to sell them. I waited, and the tap came again, and I was sure it was coming from the box. I picked the box up and held it, looking inside at the glasses. The noise was coming from the box, and I wondered if there was a trapped insect in a glass, or a mouse, or what could it be so that I quickly took the box out into the porch, turned on the bright overhead light, and yes, the tapping continued. So I put the box down, lifted out each glass, inspected, and shook them out individually on the cement. This is hard to believe, but it's entirely true. When all the glasses were out of the box, I was left holding an empty box, which was still tapping. I put my ear into the box, and absolutely, without a doubt, this empty box was the source of the sound. I was still looking for the rational explanation and decided there must be a bug of some sort down in the lining of the box, or maybe even in the corrugated spaces. So I pulled up all the flaps, turned it over, and shook it nearly to pieces. Nothing at all came out. The box continued to tap, and I suddenly felt so tired I could barely think. It was as if my brain, having come to no rational explanation, just wanted to shut down. I was looking dumbly into a small empty box in my hands, which continued to tap and tap, as though there was still glass in it. I did the only thing I could think of doing at the time. I tore the box into absolute shreds, watching for anything at all to fall out. Nothing did, and when I was done, the tap was gone. I went straight to bed and decided not to even think about it until morning, and I was immediately asleep, which was my defense mechanism. Maybe it was foolish of me, but I never brought those parfait glasses into the house again. I sent them to the dump and burned the shreds of the box. Nothing that dramatic has ever happened to me here before or since. But I've only been in this old house a few years. The other things that do happen, such as lights dimming and random noises, I don't attribute to the supernatural as a first thought, but rather to the age of the wiring and settling of the old beams. Just this year I started snapping photos inside their rooms. There are orbs, some very, very bright. I haven't decided yet if I think they're supernatural or not. But that mystery of the tapping glasses, I've never been able to resolve that. Next story. My husband and I had been married and moved into a house on Bagwell Avenue in Nutter Fort, West Virginia. I had 2 children from a previous marriage. Everything was fine when we first moved in. Then things started to happen. One night, my husband and a friend of ours and myself were sitting around playing on our computers. My husband kept telling me that it was about time for us to get to bed. After hearing him complain for about 30 minutes about being tired, I finally told him I was ready for bed also. Just then, we turned off the monitors of the computers. From the hallway directly behind us, there came a woman's voice. It very plainly said, "Thank you." We all froze instantly. We stayed up with the lights on for about another hour. And that was not all we heard or saw. There were several occasions where we would hear banging in the attic. My husband and his friend would go up there, and there would be no trace of any kind of animal or anything else up there. The dust was very thick on the floor, and you would have been able to tell if something or someone had walked on it. On another night, I was going to the bedroom to get ready for bed, and I asked my husband to get me a glass of milk. I walked into my bedroom and opened the door. The light was off, and there I saw a set of floating teeth. I screamed and ran back into the living room. My husband came running in asking what was wrong. I told him what I saw, and he went to investigate. There was nothing to be seen. During all the times that these things occurred, my youngest son met a friend. He was an imaginary friend. His name was Jim. This may just be a child having an imaginary friend, but I don't believe it to be so. I think it was the name of the person that had been scaring us. My son was only 5, so I will admit I was a little skeptical. My son would tell me the conversations that he and Jim were having, and told me that Jim was the family's friend and not to be scared. Now that we moved away from the house, he no longer has this friend. I don't know the history of the house, but I do know that there was some furniture in the attic and some papers belonging to a man. There were some pictures as well. I never did find out, though, if they belong to the imaginary Jim. Next story. I grew up in Canova, West Virginia, in a house that's been in my family for many, many years. Before I tell you the rest of the story, I will tell you I lived there through all my childhood and never saw anything. My sister, on the other hand, said she did, but that's a different story. will admit, though, that I did have strange feeling at certain times, but that was all. There's a big dogwood tree in the front yard, and the house itself sits up on a hill, but it isn't spooky looking or anything. My dad lived there as a child and had three brothers and a sister, all younger than him. When my dad was 16, the house caught fire and burned his little brother and sister up inside. Danny was 4 and Gail was 3. My grandmother rebuilt the house, but just couldn't bear to live there. She moved out, but still kept the house. At first she didn't do anything with it, but she eventually remarried, and her husband talked her into renting it out. In 1970, my dad's brother David moved in with his wife and 2 small kids. They had lived there for a few months when my Uncle David was killed while working on his car. The transmission fell out of the car onto his chest, killing him instantly. After that, my other Uncle Gene moved in. Unfortunately, he died there too. He was cleaning his gun and it went off, hitting him in the chest. He died before he got to the hospital. My grandmother deeded it to my dad in 1976, and he's lived there ever since. Now comes the eerie part. One particular night, when we were gone on vacation, our neighbor had worked the late shift and was heading home around 2 a.m. He said he came by the house and happened to look up as he passed and saw a man standing under the big dogwood tree. Knowing we were gone that week, he decided to stop and look around. He said the guy just stood there looking at him. The guy had on a pair of jeans and a white t-shirt with cigarettes rolled up on the right sleeve of his shirt. When our neighbor tried to talk to him, the man didn't answer. He told the guy to leave or he was calling the cops. The man just stood there. Our neighbor repeated himself several times and finally turned to walk back to his car. When he got to the car, he turned around and the guy wasn't under the tree anymore. He was looking out the window inside of the house. Our neighbor called the police and they came and looked around. Everything was locked tight. He also called my grandmother, who had a key, and she came to let the officers in to look around, but nothing was disturbed. When we came home, the neighbor came over to tell my dad what happened. He saw a picture hanging on the wall and asked my dad who it was. My dad said it was his brother Gene. Our neighbor said that was the man he saw. My dad turned white and said that it couldn't have been because his brother had died several years earlier. Another time when I was little, our house caught fire again. It wasn't a big fire, just started in a fuse box and was moving through the rafters of the house. It was put out before too much damage was caused. Not too strange, I know, but what was strange was the fact that no one knows and still doesn't know who called the fire department that night. No one has ever come forward to this day to admit they called. We later found out that the fire department had trouble finding the house. This was in the country. Back then, there were no numbers on houses like there are today. The fireman who was driving the truck saw a man in a white t-shirt under that same dogwood tree, motioning them to come this way. When he got out of the truck, the man was gone. The fireman then saw the smoke, so he knew for sure it was the right house. They woke us up, we got out, and they put out the fire. Since then, there's been a number of people tell us that late at night you can come by the house and see the man in the white t-shirt under the dogwood tree. I did talk to my grandma about Uncle Gene and everything that went on in the house before. My dad won't talk about any of this. He refuses to believe that his brother is still there. But anyway, my grandmother said that when the first fire happened, Gene was 14 and had gotten in with the wrong crowd of kids and was getting into a lot of trouble. He hadn't been to school in 2 or 3 weeks when a teacher sent a note home telling my grandparents this. When Gene came home, my granddad asked him about it. Gene denied it, and Granddad didn't believe him, of course. So, both of them being hot-headed, they got into a huge fight in the kitchen, where there was a wood-burning stove. They knocked the stovepipe down, and that's what started the fire that killed Danny and Gail. She said it all happened so fast that she remembered Granddad saying that he was going to get Danny and Gail out of the house where they were napping. But later, Granddad said he thought Grandma had gotten them out. They realized the kids were still inside and that it was too late to get them out, so Uncle Gene blamed himself for the death of his brother and sister. My grandma blamed my granddad, and that's why they divorced. Then, it turned out that my Uncle Gene was supposed to have helped David work on the car the day he was killed, but got sidetracked and never showed up to help. Gene believed that if he had been there to help David, he would not have died, so he also blamed himself for Uncle David's death. I think that's why he watches over that house, making sure that his only living brother doesn't fall victim to any accidents that happen on the property or in that house. That's just my theory, though. My grandma thinks he's still there because it was his childhood home.